Hello everyone. Yeah, I still cannot forget the last moment that I preached last time because I forgot the last page of my manuscript last time. So I need to check whether I have everything now. Yeah, I have everything. It is 9 pages, but don't worry, it doesn't take a long time because the font size is 14. Yeah, when I pray for a passage from the Bible for the title of Missional People, first passage from the Bible that popped up in my mind was Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3, which is a pivotal text not only in the book of Genesis, but also indeed in the whole Bible for the theme of mission. However, I chose today's main text because of 2 reasons. The first reason is that today's passage is so important in Genesis that it occurs 5 times altogether with minor variations. The second reason is that this passage includes a story of Sodom as a model of our world, but also a story of Abraham as a model of God's mission and missional people. Prior to getting into today's main passage, we need to take a look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3, because it is inextricably bound to today's passage. The translation of the English Standard Version on Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3 says, as you see the screen, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.'" Comparing to the English translation, there are 2 clear imperative verbs in Hebrew Bible. When we retranslate and restructure it in Hebrew, God's actual speech falls into 2 halves, each launched by an imperative, "Go and be a blessing." After each imperative follow 3 subordinate clauses that elucidate the implications of fulfilling the commands. It is the combination of command and promise. The mission is launched. Abraham obeys the 2 commands, "Go and be a blessing." Thereby, God's promise is released into the history of the nations. It requires a break, a radical departure, so that he can be the vehicle of blessing to the whole earth. Responding to the God's election, Abraham's own obedience was to be the model for the continuing education of his descendants from generation to generation. Next generation also must walk in the way of the Lord in righteousness and justice, so that God can accomplish the missional purpose of Abraham's election. Let's go back to today's passage, because chapter 18, verse 18 to 19 clearly articulates this connection that is a moral agenda for God's people as well as a mission statement by God. The retranslation of verse 18 to 19 from Hebrew Bible says, "Abraham will indeed become a great and mighty nation, and all nations on earth will find blessing through him. For I have chosen him for the purpose that he will teach his sons and his household after him, so they will keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, for the purpose that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised to him." Verse 18 to 19 is a monologue by the Lord who had paid a visit to Abraham's tent before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is a self-reminder of God's universal promise of blessings. As the Lord was about to leave, the Lord turned and said to Abraham in verse 20, it says, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave. Why did the Lord give Abraham warning with this speech? Did God want a witness to testify that it was God who destroyed the cities? Did God want to see how Abraham would respond to the destruction of his near neighbor? For the sake of clear answer, we need to pay attention, first of all, to that surrounding context of Sodom. As all of you know very well, Sodom represents the way of the fallen world, our society, our mind. It stands as a notorious prototype of human wickedness and of the judgment of God. In verse 20, the outcry, which is jakat in Hebrew, comes up to God from Sodom, as you see the screen. The Hebrew word jakat, which means outcry, is a word for the cry of pain or the cry for help from those who are being oppressed or violated. We can find the fact that this word is widely used throughout the Bible. It is the same word used for Israelites crying out under their slavery in Egypt. In Psalm 34 verse 17, the word outcry, jakat, is used when appealing to God to hear their cry against unjust treatment. The book of Deuteronomy also graphically describes the word jakat, outcry, that it is the scream for help by a woman being raped. When Genesis chapter 13 verse 13 says that the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord, here that sin is identified as oppression, for that is what the word outcry immediately indicates. Some people in or near Sodom were suffering to such an extent that they were crying out against its oppression and cruelty. We also find many examples how the image of Sodom and Gomorrah was used throughout the Bible. Isaiah portrays the Jerusalem of his own day in the image of Sodom and Gomorrah when condemning it for its bloodshed, corruption, and injustice. Ezekiel also describes Sodom's sin as arrogance, affluence, and callousness to the needy. They were over-proud, over-fed, and under-concerned. In this sense, it is clear that Sodom was used as a model of human society throughout the Old Testament. Sodom was a place filled with oppression, cruelty, violence, perverted sexuality, idolatry, pride, greedy consumption, and void of compassion or care for the needy. In the New Testament, when Paul did his mission to the nations, it was to the nations that he saw typified in Sodom. That is why in the book of Romans chapter 1, Paul says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all such behavior, and those who do such things deserve death. Since Sodom stands as a model of the human society under judgment, yet it was also part of the world that was the context of Abraham's calling and residence. As long as Sodom was in the land to which Abraham was commanded to go, it was in a sense the context of his mission. When there was outcry from Sodom, God on his way stopped and said to Abraham that there would be investigation and judgment. How then did Abraham respond to God's plan for the investigation of Sodom? It is indispensable for us to know how Abraham responded, because he is a model of God's missional people that we need to learn and live. Verse 22 indicates the immediate response of Abraham. It says, "So the man turned from there and went toward Sodom. But Abraham still stood before the Lord." Yes, Abraham stood before the Lord. In other words, he interceded for Sodom. The verb stand, which is amad in Hebrew, is used too extensively in the Old Testament of the physical act of standing. It is a posture of prayer and intercession. That man have felt a need for God's help is not surprising, but the fact that man may stand before the Creator of eternity and make intercession is utterly remarkable. As missional people, including you and me, we need to learn and keep in mind the missional significance of intercessory prayer. That is why our church bulletin and our email always provides prayer points for other people. Returning to the key central verse, Genesis chapter 18 verse 19, we find the fact that Abraham was chosen to be a teacher, specifically a teacher of the way of the Lord and a teacher of righteousness and justice. As a teacher of the way of the Lord, Abraham was standing and walking in the way of the Lord in the context of the way of Sodom. Walking in the way of the Lord means the imitation of God. By mirroring the divine activity, the people would become a visible model to the nations, neighbors, as to the nature and character of the God whom they worshipped. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 10, verse 17 to 19 clearly illustrates the way of the Lord for his people. It says, "For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigners residing among you, giving them food and clothing, and you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt." In this sense, to walk in the way of the Lord means doing for others what God wishes to have done for them, or more particularly, doing for others what God has already done for you and me. One of the reasons that I chose Covenant denomination as my lifelong home family is that Covenant keeps the immigrant spirit. According to the Covenant history, it says, Evangelical Covenant Church affirmed that we began as an immigrant church and celebrated that today we continue to be an immigrant church. The early immigrants of the Covenant Church faced profound challenges as they entered a new nation. America. These covenant ancestors were strengthened in their journey through faith in Jesus Christ, who was no stranger to the experiences of immigrant query. Yes, as Israelites experienced God's deliverance from alien status in Egypt and provision of food and clothing in the wilderness, the covenant ancestors experienced the way of the Lord in the United States too. Returning to our main text, Genesis chapter 18, verse 19, we see the phrase, the way of the Lord, as a strong contrast to the ways of Sodom, whose wickedness is raising the outcry God plans to investigate and judge. To follow the way of the Lord, Abraham was to be a teacher of righteousness and justice. Verse 19 says, "For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." In Hebrew, the two words righteousness and justice are paired, which means righteousness and justice are actual things that you do, not concepts you reflect on. In other words, Abraham took an action in the way of the Lord, doing righteousness and justice. In verse 20, the Lord draws Abraham's attention to his concern about the suffering of the oppressed in the area of Sodom. Verse 20 says, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave." Since the word outcry, which is jakat, in Hebrew means cry for help, the trigger for God's investigation is not only for the judgment of the sin of Sodom, but also for the protest and cries of their victims. Therefore, the way of the Lord, which Abraham is about to witness and then to teach, is to do righteousness and justice for the oppressed and against the oppressor. It descended to Moses, who learned the same lesson in the ways of the Lord, turned it into intercession, and taught it to the Israel. In the New Testament, it descended to disciples by Jesus Christ, who has all authority in heaven and on earth. As the Lord said to Abraham, "Go and be blessing," Jesus Christ commands, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of their Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you." Jesus Christ challenges you and me to see the presence of Sodom in our human society, in our church, in our neighbors, in our family, in our mind, and in our attitude. He commands you to go into that society to be a blessing as missional people. Do you want to be a missional person or not? Shall we watch a video clip that I prepared to conclude this sermon?